Time, psychologists have been aware of people who struggle with their ability to think, plan, organize, concentrate without any diagnosable condition. So, this can cause a huge amount of distress and disability. A study by Lantrip and colleagues wanted to explore what might be linked to this and how we can help. So, firstly, we call this ability to plan, shift, and sustain our attention executive functions. And we all need these cognitive abilities to structure our lives and accomplish the goals we desire. So, as you can see here, some examples of executive functioning, like working memory and inhibition control. So, say you like wanted to save up for a holiday, you would need to inhibit urges to spend money on things that you don't particularly need. You'd need to remind yourself of what your goal is as you carry on with your life, which is the role of working memory. Uh, so as you can see, executive functions are really important to structuring our lives. It's been suggested in past studies that trauma, often stemming from childhood maltreatment, shares some kind of relationship to these cognitive issues. So, childhood maltreatment is defined as the power and trust placed in an adult caretaker being misused to harm a child or failure to meet their basic needs. Five broad classes of childhood maltreatment are physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, and physical and emotional neglect, which this study is going to explore. So, let's first look at what the study did and what it found. So, in this study, the experimenters wanted to see if different types of childhood maltreatment would share unique relationships with cognitive problems. Focusing on executive functions, of course. Like maybe someone who experienced physical neglect in childhood would have more difficulty with working memory than someone who experienced physical abuse and so on. They also wanted to see if post-traumatic stress disorder and lifetime trauma events had some kind of relationship with executive functions, mostly to see if post-traumatic stress disorder impacted executive functioning, which is a pretty reasonable assumption to make. So as we can see here, this is just like a basic slide showing the predictions of the different variables and what kind of relationship they share to each other. So it's basically just looking at abuse, neglect up there, and lifetime trauma events and PTSD all being linked to self-reported executive function problems. So if executive function does originate from a traumatic childhood, then understanding the types of trauma that influence cognitive problems would be very useful in developing effective interventions. So the experimenters asked 48 people, just move out of the way so you can see the writing, who reported to be experiencing subjective cognitive problems to complete a series of questionnaires and measures. So there's the brief A that measures executive function problems, PTSD questionnaire, and lifetime trauma events. The aim was to see if the scores on these different measures had some kind of relationship to each other, to put it simply. So, what did they find? In this sample, emotional neglect was found to share a relationship with executive dysfunction, specifically difficulty with shifting attention, self monitoring, task initiation, and planning. The correlation had a positive moderate effect size, which basically means that higher scores on emotional neglect questions predicted higher scores for executive dysfunction. So this scatter plot behind me was taken from the study. On one axis is the executive function measure. The other axis is the emotional neglect. And as you can see, there's a very vague diagonal line going upwards, which is indicative of a moderate positive relationship. So no other forms of maltreatment were found to share a relationship with executive function. And this is a little surprising because it's been unclear why that would be. These other types of trauma you would imagine would have pretty huge effects on people, but they just weren't found to be here. So the researchers concluded that emotional regulation interventions for people who face emotional neglect may help with these cognitive issues. So now that we've looked at what happened, let's start to look a little bit closely at the study and try and understand what's going on. So to start with the strengths, there's a really strong logical hypothesis based on past findings of a differential relationship between childhood maltreatment and cognitive complaints. And this is nicely backed up by past findings. So, for example, a study by Nikulina and Whittam found that childhood neglect resulted in poorer performance on executive function, but sexual and physical maltreatment did not. So, in a way, the present study adds to the knowledge built here by proposing that it's emotional neglect more specifically. The researchers also did a really good job of pointing out that because this is a correlational study looking at relationships and not causality, um, that an experiment that the variables that were associated could share all kinds of bidirectional relationships, which basically means that, like, for example, having executive function problems could put children at high risk of maltreatment, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's the study, the Widom and Nicolina study. Let's get into some limitations now, though. So the researchers stated they found a pattern of association between trauma types and executive function, which I think is a little bit misleading. Although they did somewhat report a differential relationship of trauma and executive functioning, this is only from emotional neglect, which, as I will show, is partly inconsistent with previous findings and may have some issues with validity. So, in an attempt in making sense of the findings, the researchers discussed the possibility that trauma might heighten the limbic system, which is also known as like the emotional parts of our brain. So, it's the part of our brain that's responsible for processing emotions. So, that would make the individual have to emotionally regulate more and thereby disrupt executive functioning. However, this interpretation doesn't account for the fact that difficulties in emotional control did not share a relationship to emotional neglect, which kind of undercuts that interpretation. Also, McLaughlin studies found that sexual and physical maltreatment cause heightened emotional responses to negative stimuli found from using brain scans. So, because of these unusual and inconsistent results, it can sometimes be helpful to look more closely at the study design, which is basically how the study was structured and how it was set up. So, one factor that jumps out to me in the study design is the use of self-report questionnaires, the brief A that I mentioned before. So rather than a performance-based measure of cognition, the researchers argued that self-reported cognitive complaints share relationships with various aspects of the participants' lives, but don't really include any evidence to support this claim. The justification for using self-report, therefore, is a bit weak, but also with past research even raising questions about the construct validity of the measure. So, yeah, what is construct validity? Why is that important here? So, construct validity basically means whether a measure is capturing what it intends to measure, such as a ruler actually measuring centimeters in length. This can be difficult to determine in psychology as we're often measuring things that aren't directly observable, like depression or personality. So, you can always observe someone behaving depressed, but you can never objectively encounter the depression itself that you're trying to measure. So, a ruler measures centimeters in length. Brief A measures difficulty in executive function. It's a little bit different. So, a study that intended to test the construct validity of the brief A, the measure that is trying to capture executive function problems, found that after comparing self reported executive function scores to measures of personality, they concluded that the brief A is most likely an invalid measure as its scoring outcomes can be predicted based on emotional distress. A paper by Toplak argued that self-reported measures of executive function are actually measuring a different underlying mental construct to performance measures. Therefore, these unusual results may be a reflection of the fact that brief A is not capturing executive functioning, but rather symptoms of emotional distress. And that may share some unique relationship to emotional neglect. But it becomes difficult to draw, objective, uh, credible conclusions because it's not clear what we're measuring in this study. So where to from now? Um, I believe that I think an understanding, a more comprehensive understanding of what it means to have a subjective cognitive complaint and to what extent people are actually having performance difficulties or just perceiving themselves that way. I think that needs to be established more in depth. So are subjective cognitive complaints or subjective executive dysfunction completely different phenomenon to, performance dysfunction, or do they share some overlap? So that paper by Toplak that I mentioned before found evidence that performance and self-rated measures measure efficiency and self-reflexivity, respectively. So could this mean that victims of emotional neglect have a tendency to rate themselves more harshly? I think an exact same study as the one before the present study, but utilizing a performance measure that arrives at different results to the present study would be, really telling of this. So, weak support from the study suggests that therapies that target emotional processing, like exposure therapy, would help people with executive dysfunction. But as I've argued, that's not really a great justification since Schwartz and Topak gave evidence that the brief A does not capture executive function ability. However, to the researchers' credit, they suggest whether we are seeing method variance, where different measurement approaches yield different results. The recommendation of using a performance-based measure in future studies may enlighten us to whether emotional neglect is actually resulting in executive dysfunction or more just emotional issues. So, in conclusion, the study found subjective executive dysfunction is related to emotional neglect. However, serious concerns were raised about the brief A, like is it actually measuring executive dysfunction or is it measuring something else? So based on this, future studies may be better off using performance-based or testing using both. And although executive dysfunction is a significant issue, it is also just one of many pathologies associated with childhood trauma. And our understanding of it and treatment of it has to be holistic. A systemic approach to how trauma and stress and emotional regulation and cognition impact one another may offer a better way to treatments. Thank you.